Story 1. It was an unremarkable, quiet evening when the first chill of unease crept into my bones. My dog, Max, started barking, frantic, guttural sounds that didn't belong in the usual rhythm of the night. Max was a vocal dog, especially when the neighbor's tabby strutted arrogantly across the yard or perched smugly in the bushes near the fence. Tonight, though, his bark carried something else, something primal. I sighed, pushing myself off the couch, expecting to catch sight of that smug little feline taunting Max again. As I peered out the window, I was ready to scold Max for overreacting. But what I saw drained the color from my face. There, at the edge of the property, stood a figure. A person. They didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just stood. Watching. Shadows swallowed their features, their face obscured in a way that felt deliberate. My stomach churned. A cold weight pressed against my chest as my pulse quickened. Max's barking grew more desperate, claws scratching against the hardwood floor as he paced, but I barely registered him. My focus was pinned to that figure, unmoving, yet exuding a quiet menace that sent a cold ripple through me. I took a shaky step back from the window, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a prank? A neighbor with a bizarre sense of humor? But no one would stand so still. So quiet. So deliberate. The chill in the room seemed to deepen. My trembling hand reached for the door's lock, and I twisted it tight, the soft click of the mechanism barely comforting. I told myself it was nothing, a mistake, someone passing through. But my instincts whispered otherwise. The way they stood there, utterly motionless, felt unnatural. Like they weren't bound by the rules of normal people, of normal movement. It was wrong. Max's barking became deafening, his urgency almost palpable. I tried to reassure myself, pacing to the living room window to catch another glimpse. And there they were, still there. Still watching. My breath hitched. I made the mistake of moving closer to the door. I had to know, had to see. Slowly, I turned the handle, the cool metal biting against my skin. My heart thudded in my ears as I eased the door open just a crack. The night air greeted me, cool and sharp. Vulnerability clawed at me as I leaned forward, peering into the darkness. And there they were. Still. Watching. Their posture didn't shift, didn't falter. The longer I stared, the less human they seemed. My chest tightened as panic surged through me. I slammed the door shut, bolted it, and stumbled back, nearly tripping over Max as he barked in a frenzy. I couldn't think straight. My mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was this person lost? Drunk? Or was it something worse, something deliberate, predatory? The minutes dragged, each second stretching painfully as I debated my next move. The oppressive silence beyond Max's barking was maddening. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my voice shaky as I described the figure that had rooted itself in my yard. The operator's reassurances did little to calm me as I glanced toward the window. And that's when I saw it. They were gone. The yard, which moments ago felt like the stage of some silent nightmare, was now empty. My stomach twisted. Did they leave? Or were they still there, hidden, waiting? When the police finally arrived, their flashing lights painted the house in harsh reds and blues. Officers swept the property, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. They found nothing, no footprints, no signs of anyone lurking. Their polite explanations of a misunderstanding or a prank rang hollow. As they left, their words hung in the air, brittle and useless. Call us if it happens again. I sat in the living room, staring out the window long after they were gone. Max had calmed, lying at my feet, but his occasional whimpers mirrored the unease that gnawed at me. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside, half expecting to find some trace of the figure. A crushed blade of grass. A footprint. anything. But there was nothing. The yard was undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there. Yet, the sensation lingered, that unmistakable, gut-wrenching feeling of being watched. And even now, I can't shake the thought, they were out there. Somewhere. Waiting. Story 2. At first, I didn't think much of it. The small, strange occurrences seemed easy to brush off, things slightly out of place in my apartment, faint noises in the dead of night, and that fleeting but unmistakable feeling of being watched. I told myself it was nothing. After all, I lived alone in a secure apartment complex. The idea that someone could be sneaking into my home was absurd, almost laughable. But the unease didn't fade. In fact, it grew. It started with small, easily dismissed incidents. One morning, I found the kitchen cabinet ajar, even though I was certain I'd closed it the night before. Another day, I noticed the bathroom towel hanging differently, as if someone had used it. I chalked it up to forgetfulness or maybe a breeze shifting things around. But deep down, a quiet voice in my head whispered that something wasn't right. Then, one night, I woke to the sound of soft tapping on my window. My heart froze. I lay there, holding my breath, straining to hear any other sound. Finally, I mustered the courage to look outside. No one was there. That was the moment the fragile wall of denial I'd built around myself began to crumble. I needed answers. The building had security cameras in the common areas and parking lot, but I'd never paid them much attention. That night, as I sat on my couch with my phone in hand, a terrible thought crept into my mind: what if I missed something? I pulled up the security footage app and scrolled through the recordings from the past week. At first, it was all routine, neighbors coming and going, cars pulling into the lot. Nothing unusual. But then, at around 2:30 p.m. on Tuesday, I saw it. A figure. They were wearing a hoodie, the shadows swallowing their face. I froze, my stomach twisting as I watched them enter the building. Something about the way they moved felt familiar, but I couldn't place it. At first, I convinced myself it was just another tenant or a guest visiting someone on my floor. But then the footage showed them approaching my door. My breath caught. I watched in disbelief as they produced a key and unlocked my apartment door. My apartment. A wave of nausea hit me as I rewound the footage, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure paused outside my door, looking around before slipping inside, shutting the door quietly behind them. I wasn't home. I'd been at work. And no one else had keys to my apartment, not friends, not family. For nearly an hour, the figure moved through my space. The footage didn't have the detail to show exactly what they were doing, but I could see their silhouette wandering through my living room, my kitchen, even my bedroom. They didn't rush. They weren't searching frantically. It was slow. Deliberate. As though they belonged there. I couldn't watch anymore. My stomach twisted into knots. Someone had been inside my apartment, moving through my space like it was their own. I checked the entry log for the building. Nothing. The figure hadn't signed in. It was as if they had simply appeared. I replayed the footage, desperate for a clue. Something about their movements felt familiar, like they knew the layout of my home. But their face remained obscured, hidden by that damn hood. Frustration bubbled inside me as I fast-forwarded through the rest of the video, hoping for a slip-up, a mistake, something that would reveal who they were. But there was nothing. The realization hit me like a brick: whoever this was, they had planned this. They had a key, they knew my schedule, and they knew how to avoid leaving any trace. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, every creak of the apartment building sending my pulse racing. Were they still watching me? Waiting? The next morning, I marched into the leasing office, my voice shaking as I explained what I'd seen. The manager looked concerned, but their reassurances felt hollow. "We'll look into it," they said. "But unless there's evidence of a break-in, there's not much we can do." Their words only deepened the pit in my stomach. When I returned home that evening, I stood outside my door, paralyzed by dread. My hand hovered over the key. The air around me felt heavy, oppressive. Finally, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, my every nerve on edge. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Nothing was out of place. But the silence felt different, charged, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I checked every room, every corner, every closet. There was no one there. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was, they'd be back. That night, I slept with the lights on, the security footage replaying in my mind. The figure moving through my apartment. The knowledge that they'd been in my bedroom. And the unshakable dread that they weren't done with me yet. Story 3. I had been out with friends, savoring a rare night of carefree laughter at a new bar downtown. The drinks flowed freely, and the stories and jokes seemed to stretch time itself. When I finally stepped outside, the crisp night air hit me like a cold slap, snapping me out of my hazy buzz. It was well past midnight. I remember unlocking my car, tossing my bag onto the passenger seat, and driving home, the hum of the tires blending with the foggy blur of my thoughts. When I reached my apartment, I parked my car in the usual spot by the curb. Routine. Lock the doors, shuffle upstairs, and collapse into bed. The familiar hum of the fridge greeted me as I stepped inside, joined by the soft glow of the streetlight outside my window. Exhaustion pulled me under like a heavy tide, and soon I was fast asleep, lost in a dreamless void. Morning came with its usual city soundtrack, cars passing, the faint hum of distant traffic. But something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, brushing it off as the remnants of sleep clinging to me. Stretching lazily, I shuffled to the window and glanced outside. My car wasn't there. I froze, staring at the empty space where I knew I had parked it. The curbside was bare, my car's familiar outline missing from the lineup of vehicles. My chest tightened, a flutter of panic rising like a cold hand gripping my heart. Could I have parked somewhere else? No. I distinctly remembered leaving it there. I threw on clothes and rushed outside, scanning the street frantically. My mind raced to piece together the foggy details of the previous night. Maybe I was just being forgetful, I told myself. But the unease settled in deeper, like a chill that refused to leave my bones. Back in my apartment, I grabbed my phone and pulled up the GPS tracker I'd installed in my car, something I'd added for peace of mind long ago. Relief washed over me as the app showed my car was still in the same spot I had parked it last night. But that relief was short-lived, replaced by an icy dread. How could that be? I hadn't been drunk enough to forget something so basic. The memory of locking my car and heading upstairs was vivid in my mind. My thoughts spiraled, searching for explanations that made sense. Maybe I'd made a mistake. Maybe, no, something wasn't right. I called a friend, trying to keep my voice casual. Hey, weird question. You know how I parked my car on the street outside my apartment last night? It's gone. I laughed nervously, hoping they'd say something to snap me out of this growing unease. Maybe you parked somewhere else and forgot, they suggested lightly. Their words didn't help. They couldn't erase the sinking feeling in my gut. I ended the call and stared out the window again. The street looked so normal. The cars lined up neatly, untouched, except for the space where mine should have been. Deciding to search for it myself, I walked the block, checking every corner and alley. Each step felt heavier than the last, my dread growing with every empty space. My mind turned over every possibility. Had it been towed? Stolen? Or worse, had someone been watching me, waiting for the moment I left it unattended? Just as I was about to give up, a sick thought crossed my mind: what if the GPS tracker was right? I pulled up the app again, staring at the blinking icon that marked my car's location. It was still showing the exact same spot I'd parked it last night. My stomach twisted. How could that be? Desperate, I decided to drive around, retracing my steps from the night before. I needed to see for myself. Each familiar street brought no answers, only more questions. Then, as I rounded a corner near the main road, my heart stopped. There it was. My car. It was parked in an alley, just off the street, tucked away like it had been deliberately hidden. For a moment, I just stared, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. How had it gotten here? I hadn't driven it. I knew I hadn't. I parked behind it and stepped out, my pulse pounding in my ears. The closer I got, the stranger everything felt. The front tires were angled sharply, as if someone had parked it with care, a detail that sent a shiver down my spine. I never parked like that. I never even drove like that. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was something else. I circled the car, my fingers trembling as I touched the hood. It was cold, untouched. And yet, it didn't feel like mine anymore. Something about it felt wrong, as if it had been violated in some way I couldn't see. I climbed back into my car, my hands gripping the wheel as my mind raced. Whoever had done this wasn't just moving my car. They were toying with me. Watching me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, this wasn't over. As I sat there, the faint hum of my engine my only companion, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had done this was waiting. Watching. Planning their next move. Story 4. At first, I dismissed it as just the house settling. Old homes have their quirks, and this one was no exception. Since the day I moved in, I'd grown used to the creaks, groans, and sighs that filled the quiet nights. The wind whistled through the gaps in the windows, the pipes clattered when the water ran, and the floors whispered beneath my feet. It was just the personality of the place, I told myself. So, when I first heard faint whispers coming through the vents, I brushed it off as another harmless oddity. The sound was so soft, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator or the rustle of the trees outside. I couldn't make out the words, if there even were words. It was just a low murmur, like distant voices carried on the wind. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind slipping through the ducts, or the house finding yet another way to groan in its old age. But the whispers didn't go away. They grew harder to ignore. Each night, they seemed clearer, louder, more deliberate. I'd lie in bed, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the sound always seemed to be coming from inside the house, not outside. One night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. This time, it was unmistakable, a soft voice, too low to understand but too deliberate to be noise. My heart began to race as I realized it was coming from the vent in the corner of my room. I stared at it, the darkness behind the grate seeming deeper than it should be. But the house was still, and nothing moved. I told myself it was nothing more than the pipes rattling or air flowing through the ducts. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The following night, the whispers returned, louder and more persistent. I tried drowning them out with music or the TV, but it didn't work. The sound seemed to seep into the walls, wrapping around me like a fog. And then, through the murmur, I heard it, clear, deliberate, and unmistakable. It said my name. Evelyn. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and my body refused to move. I was alone. I lived alone. And yet, someone, or something, had just spoken my name. My legs felt like jelly as I got out of bed, my gaze fixed on the vent. I crept toward it, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run. But I had to know. I crouched in front of the vent, staring into the darkness behind the metal grate. Of course, there was nothing there. No one. Just the cold, still air. But the whispers didn't stop. They swirled around me, faint and chaotic, like voices just out of reach. I leaned closer, my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when I heard it again, my name, echoing softly, almost lovingly. The next night, I couldn't pretend anymore. This wasn't the house settling. This wasn't the pipes or the wind. The whispers had become more insistent, almost desperate, as if they were trying to get my attention. When I lay down to sleep, the murmurs began almost immediately. But tonight was different. The voice that called my name wasn't alone. Other voices joined in, overlapping in a dissonant chorus that filled the room. My chest tightened as I sat up in bed, wide-eyed and trembling. The voices were louder now, clearer. And then I heard it. Evelyn. Come closer. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. The air in the room grew icy, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist. My gaze locked on the vent, and I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, like invisible hands were guiding me. Against my will, I got out of bed and moved toward the vent. The whispers intensified with each step, their words sharp and urgent. Come closer, Evelyn. We know you're listening. Come closer. I knelt in front of the vent, my whole body trembling. The darkness behind the grate seemed alive, shifting and writhing. My hand reached out, almost on its own, as if I had no control over my movements. But then I stopped. I stumbled back, heart racing, and ran out of the room. I didn't stop until I was in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound grounding me in reality. I spent the rest of the night there, unable to bring myself to go back. The next morning, I called a friend and told her everything. I expected her to laugh, to tell me I was imagining things. But when I mentioned the voice calling my name, her expression changed. Her face paled, and her voice wavered. That's not normal, she said quietly. You need to get someone to check the house. Maybe it's something in the vents. Her words didn't comfort me. They only confirmed what I already feared. I called an old family friend, a retired contractor, to inspect the house. He checked the vents, the pipes, and the walls, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Old houses make noise, he said with a shrug, but as he left, he muttered something under his breath that sent a chill through me. Some houses hold on to things. Old houses especially. That night, the whispers came again. But they weren't coming from the vents anymore. They were coming from inside the walls. And this time, they weren't just calling my name. Evelyn, please, come to us. The voices were frantic now, desperate. My name echoed over and over, filling the house with a terrible, oppressive energy. I sat frozen in my bed, unable to move as the whispers swirled around me, louder and louder. And then, as if they were right next to me, I heard the words that made my blood run cold. Evelyn, we've been waiting for you. Story 5. The cool night air clung to me like a second skin as I strolled through the park, the quiet only broken by the soft rustling of leaves. The streetlights cast long, uneven shadows, and the winding path ahead seemed to blur into an almost dreamlike haze. Late-night walks had always been my sanctuary, a time to escape the chaos of the day and let my thoughts drift freely. But tonight, something felt off. The air carried an unusual heaviness, as though the park itself was holding its breath. My steps slowed as I approached the old wooden bench beneath the towering oak tree. At first, I thought the figure seated there was just another restless soul like me, seeking solace in the stillness. But as I drew closer, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The man wasn't lost in thought, he was staring directly at me. His gaze was unyielding, sharp as a blade, cutting through the darkness between us. Under the dim glow of the street lamp, his features were obscured, but his presence dominated the space, as if the entire park had bent itself around him. I hesitated, a voice in the back of my mind urging me to take a different path. Yet, despite my unease, I kept moving forward, driven by a strange mix of curiosity and dread. As I got closer, it became clear that he hadn't moved a muscle. He sat perfectly still, his posture unnaturally rigid, like a marionette waiting for its strings to be pulled. His clothes were dark and unremarkable, blending seamlessly with the shadows, but there was something wrong about him. Something I couldn't name but could feel in every fiber of my being. I averted my gaze, hoping to shake the growing unease curling in my stomach. But his stare didn't just linger, it felt invasive, as if it were reaching inside me, peeling back layers of my thoughts. My pace quickened instinctively, the urge to create distance overwhelming. Then, his voice shattered the silence. Low and smooth, it slipped through the night like smoke. "You shouldn't be out here so late." The words stopped me cold. They weren't shouted or even spoken loudly, yet they rang in my ears as if he'd whispered them directly beside me. My heart thundered in my chest. How did he know? Why did he say that? I turned to face him fully, my legs trembling as I struggled to process the situation. The park had always been my haven, a place I felt safe, but now it felt foreign, hostile. His words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. For the first time in years, I felt a primal knot of fear tighten deep in my gut. He didn't move. He didn't need to. His eyes did all the work, pinning me in place with a calm, unnerving intensity. I felt exposed, like a fly caught in a spider's web. I told myself to walk away, to run if I had to, but my feet refused to listen. The silence between us stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted. His head tilted ever so slightly, as if studying me, calculating. The motion sent a shiver down my spine. Finally, he spoke again, his tone softer but no less unsettling. "Sometimes," he said, his words dripping with cryptic meaning, "we don't realize the things we're walking toward. But they're always there, waiting for us to notice." I blinked, my mind grasping at the fragments of his words, trying to piece them together. What was he talking about? Me? The park? Something else entirely? The weight of his gaze pressed down on me, and I knew I had to leave. My body finally responded, and I took a stumbling step backward, then another. His expression remained unchanged, calm yet knowing, as though he'd already predicted my every move. "Are you okay?" he asked suddenly, his voice unexpectedly gentle, almost concerned. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was dry, and my heart was racing too fast for words. Instead, I turned sharply and began walking away, my legs carrying me as quickly as they could manage. I didn't look back until I was nearly out of the park, the streetlights ahead beckoning like a lighthouse in a storm. When I finally dared to glance over my shoulder, he was still there. Sitting on the bench. Watching me. His gaze followed me until I disappeared around the bend. Even as I stepped onto the sidewalk, into the safety of the streetlights, the feeling clung to me, that oppressive, knowing stare. It wasn't just his eyes that had followed me, it was something more, something I couldn't name. And though I was no longer in the park, I couldn't shake the eerie certainty that somewhere, somehow, he was still watching. Waiting for me to notice what I hadn't yet realized. Story 6. The estate sale unfolded on a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the sunlight still carried a faint warmth, though the air hinted at the icy fingers of approaching winter. Scattered across the lawn were remnants of another life, antique furniture, tarnished trinkets, and forgotten keepsakes, each exuding a silent gravity of untold stories. I hadn't planned on buying anything that day. My intention was merely to browse, to wander among the curiosities. But then, tucked in the shadowy corner of the garage, I saw it. A mirror. At first glance, it wasn't remarkable. Its wooden frame was aged, weathered in a way that spoke of decades passing in quiet obscurity. Dust dulled its surface, yet something about it felt magnetic. The elderly woman running the sale noticed me lingering and approached, her smile warm but her eyes betraying something deeper, a glint of knowledge she wasn't quite ready to share. "That mirror's been in our family for generations," she said, her voice tinged with a strange wistfulness. "It's seen things." Her words lingered, but I brushed them off, chalking it up to the kind of sentimentality that clings to old objects. Without hesitation, I handed her the cash, feeling a subtle shiver run through me as the mirror exchanged hands. At home, I unwrapped it carefully, the brittle newspaper crinkling beneath my fingers. I leaned it against the wall in my living room, eager to take a closer look. Wiping away the grime, I noticed the frame bore intricate carvings I hadn't seen before, delicate, almost hypnotic swirls that seemed to shift under the dim light. But it was the glass itself that held me captive. It wasn't pristine, slightly clouded with age, but as I stepped back to admire the piece, something about the reflection gave me pause. At first, I told myself it was a trick of the light. Perhaps the angle of the sun through the window was distorting the image. Yet no matter how I moved, the reflection remained off. The walls, the furniture, even the floorboards, it was as if I was peering into another version of my living room, one dressed in muted tones and an unsettling air of formality. Then, I saw them. A woman in a dark gown glided past, her silhouette hauntingly elegant. Behind her, a man in a suit that seemed to belong to another century followed. They moved with an otherworldly grace, completely unaware of my presence, or perhaps ignoring it. My heart thundered in my chest as I blinked, and the figures dissolved, leaving the room empty but no less chilling. I told myself I was imagining things. The fatigue of the day, the excitement of the find, it had to be playing tricks on me. But the unease clung to me like a shadow. The next morning, I approached the mirror again, half convinced I'd see nothing unusual. Yet the reflection had changed once more. The scene was darker now, more oppressive. The woman in the gown stood still, her face pale and angular, her gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that froze me in place. She raised a hand, slow and deliberate, as though reaching out to the glass itself. I stumbled backward, gasping, and the image shifted again. The woman vanished, replaced by a dimly lit hallway lined with aged portraits, their painted eyes following me with an accusatory weight. The atmosphere around me felt suffocating, as if the mirror wasn't just showing me another world, it was drawing me into it. Desperate for answers, I recalled the woman's words at the sale. Generations. Family. There had to be more to this mirror than its weathered charm. My search began that day, hours spent combing through online forums and archives. One name surfaced again and again, Evelyn Grayson. A wealthy socialite who had lived in a grand mansion just outside the city, a mansion that had burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances in the 1920s. Rumors swirled about her involvement in occult practices, whispers of rituals and artifacts that blurred the lines between worlds. Could this mirror have belonged to her? At the library, I finally unearthed an old journal entry from 1924. It described a mirror used in rituals, said to reveal not only glimpses of the past but doorways to other realms. The final words of the entry chilled me to my core: once you look into it, you may never escape. I raced home, panic rising like bile in my throat. As I stepped into the living room, the air felt heavier, oppressive. The mirror loomed larger than I remembered, and as I drew closer, I heard them, the whispers. Faint, fragmented voices seeping through the glass like smoke. I forced myself to look, and there they were again. The woman. The man. Others now, crowding the reflection, their eyes fixed on me with a hunger I couldn't fathom. The mirror wasn't just a window into their world. It was a door. And I was the one who had opened it. Now, I sit here, writing this, the whispers growing louder, the figures pressing closer. The mirror won't let me look away. It's waiting. For what, I don't know. But I'm afraid I'll find out. Story 7. For weeks, the laundry room in my apartment complex had an air of unease that was hard to ignore. It started subtly, odd noises late at night, faint shuffling, the scratch of something against the walls, and footsteps when no one should have been there. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination or perhaps a neighbor's late-night laundry run. But as the days stretched on, the disturbances grew more peculiar. The overhead light in the laundry room flickered even when the room was empty. Detergent bottles shifted spots, dryer sheets vanished, and clothes were inexplicably left in disarray. It wasn't just me who noticed. My neighbors mentioned feeling a similar discomfort when walking past the room after dark. They spoke of shadows moving behind the frosted glass window when no one was inside and claimed to have heard faint, muffled laughter or voices near the door. Despite our growing unease, the building manager dismissed it all with an apathetic shrug, attributing it to overactive imaginations. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, after hearing the unmistakable sound of rustling fabric, I decided to investigate. Grabbing my phone for light, I tiptoed down the dimly lit hallway. The door to the laundry room was slightly ajar, creaking softly as I nudged it open. My flashlight illuminated an empty room, or so it seemed. But then I noticed a small, tattered blanket draped over one of the chairs. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong in the sterile, utilitarian space. Over the following week, the sense of wrongness deepened. I started documenting the disturbances, lights inexplicably left on, strange sounds, and items moved out of place. Each time I gathered evidence, I approached the building manager, but his dismissals grew more frustrating. He blamed a faulty lock for the open door and old building quirks for the noises, brushing off my concerns entirely. One afternoon, things escalated. The laundry room door stood wide open, an unusual sight since it was always locked when not in use. Determined to uncover the truth, I crept toward the door. What I saw stopped me cold. In the far corner of the room, huddled under the same tattered blanket, was a woman. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale and lined with exhaustion. Her belongings, a few scattered items and crumpled wrappers, were piled around her. She froze when she saw me, her eyes wide with fear. Slowly, she backed into the corner, her posture defensive yet resigned, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. I stepped back, heart pounding, unsure of what to do. She didn't look dangerous, just desperate. I realized she was likely seeking refuge in the only place she could find. Torn between compassion and unease, I retreated, leaving her there. That night, my mind raced with questions. Should I call the authorities? Try to help her? Confront the manager again? The next morning, I made another call to the building manager, this time speaking with a firm urgency. I told him about the woman, about the evidence I'd collected, and the seriousness of the situation. For the first time, he seemed to listen, though his response was lukewarm at best. He promised to check it out. Days passed before any action was taken. When I saw the manager again, he had locked the laundry room door. The woman was gone. No explanation was given, no acknowledgement of what had transpired. The incident was swept under the rug, as if it had never happened. The laundry room returned to its mundane, quiet state, but the unease lingered. I couldn't forget her haunted eyes, the way she'd clutched that blanket like a shield. I never found out who she was or where she went, and the building manager offered no answers. In the end, it wasn't just the woman's presence that unsettled me, it was the silence that followed her disappearance, the way people preferred to look away rather than confront uncomfortable truths. The laundry room might have returned to normal, but something about the building felt irreparably altered, a shadow lingering just out of sight. Story 8. I woke to the sound of heavy breathing in the dark beside my bed. It was rhythmic, almost labored, filling the silence of the room. For a fleeting moment, I told myself it had to be my imagination, some remnant of a dream slipping through the cracks of consciousness. But as I lay there, frozen under the covers, the sound grew louder, sharper, as though it was coming from someone mere inches away. Breathing, ragged and uneven, like they had just run miles to stand there, beside me. My heart hammered in my chest, its frantic rhythm echoing in my ears. I strained to listen, hoping to pinpoint the source, but my mind rebelled, unwilling to comprehend. The darkness pressed against my eyelids, and when I finally forced them open, the room was a blur of vague, shapeless shadows. The air felt wrong, thick, suffocating, as if it had been drained of oxygen and replaced with something oppressive. I didn't dare move. The smallest sound might alert whoever, or whatever, was standing there. My body refused to obey, paralyzed by terror, and even when I tried to call out, no words came. My throat tightened as though the very act of speaking would be a fatal mistake. A cold, clammy sweat beaded on my skin, the back of my neck prickling with an animal instinct to flee, though my limbs were leaden. The sound continued. Breathing. Close. So close. My mind screamed for me to do something, anything, but all I could do was lie there, a prisoner of my own fear. Then, as if acting on instinct alone, my trembling hand crept toward the lamp on my nightstand. Every movement felt like dragging my body through quicksand. My fingers fumbled for the switch, and with a desperate flick, the room was flooded with harsh light. The shadows retreated, their shapes stretching unnaturally across the walls, but nothing, no one, was there. The room was empty, the bed untouched, every corner as mundane as it had been hours earlier. And yet, the sound of that breathing still echoed in my head, lingering like a phantom. I sat up, my heart racing as I scanned the room, still expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the corners. I checked under the bed, behind the curtains, even inside the closet. Nothing. I was alone. But was I? The air still felt heavy, oppressive, as though the room hadn't yet returned to normal. My legs trembled as I sat back on the bed, my body weak with exhaustion. Maybe I'd dreamed it. Maybe my mind had conjured it all in some half-waking state. I clung to that thought, desperate for an explanation. Yet deep down, I knew better. The feeling of being watched, that suffocating sensation of someone breathing beside me, was too vivid, too real. I wrapped myself in the covers, curling into a tight ball, and stared at the clock on the nightstand. 3:07 a.m. The hour when the world seemed suspended between reality and something darker, something unseen. The minutes dragged on, each creak of the house jolting my nerves. I told myself over and over that it had been a trick of the mind. But every subtle noise, the faint rustle in the walls, the almost imperceptible shift in the air, drove a splinter of doubt deeper into my mind. Eventually, exhaustion won. My eyelids grew heavy, though sleep didn't bring comfort. Dreams danced with half-formed shadows and whispering breaths, and the sensation of being watched lingered, just out of reach. When morning finally came, the sunlight pouring through the window felt harsh, intrusive, as though it were mocking the fragile comfort of daylight. I sat up slowly, every muscle sore from a night spent coiled in fear. The house was quiet, ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I moved from room to room, checking doors and windows, but everything was just as I had left it. No signs of intrusion, no evidence of anything unusual. Yet that sensation, the heavy air, the invisible presence, still clung to me, like a cold hand on my shoulder. Was it just a dream? I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe it. But the memory of that breathing, so close, so real, wouldn't let me go. Even now, as I try to brush it off as a trick of the mind, I can't ignore the feeling that something had been there. Something that hadn't entirely left. And worse, something that might be waiting to return. Story 9. The Cold Case, a story of shadows and secrets. For nearly a decade, I had prowled the city as a journalist, chasing leads and unearthing the truths buried beneath its surface. Most stories felt routine after so many years, familiar puzzles with edges worn down by time. But the Cold Case was different. It came to me like a whisper in a crowded room, subtle yet impossible to ignore. On the surface, it seemed unremarkable, a missing persons report from nearly 2 decades ago. The file contained only fragments, a handful of blurry photos, fractured witness accounts, and the faint echo of a name long forgotten by the city's consciousness. Her name was Laura Kelly. Laura was 23 when she vanished one stifling summer night in 2004, leaving no footprints behind. At the time, her disappearance had haunted the front pages for months, a ghostly question that taunted everyone who read it. But, as all unresolved stories do, it faded. Buried under the weight of newer tragedies, Laura's story sank into obscurity. The file I received from the local police department was a cemetery of dead ends, conflicting accounts, cryptic statements from friends, and vague leads that circled back to nothing. Yet something about the case unsettled me. It gnawed at the edges of my mind, a feeling I couldn't shake, like a photograph hiding a shadow just out of frame. The first clue that broke through the noise was a name, Tom Jennings. He was Laura's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance and the last known person to see her alive. Tom's name wasn't just familiar, it was infamous. A polished, magnetic businessman with a sharp grin and a sharper reputation, Tom was the kind of man who walked into a room and bent it to his will. I'd crossed paths with him a few times over the years, but never closely enough to see what lay beneath the charm. If there was any truth to uncover, I knew it began with him. Tracking Tom down was no easy feat. He had built walls around himself, PR teams, locked doors, and an air of untouchable confidence that seemed impenetrable. Weeks passed as I navigated through layers of gatekeepers, my persistence finally rewarded with a meeting in his sleek high-rise office overlooking the city's skyline. Tom was exactly as I remembered, polished, disarming, and unnervingly composed. He answered my questions with a practiced ease, his words flowing like honey over steel. He spoke at length about his business ventures and charity work, but when the subject turned to Laura, a subtle shift rippled through him. His answers grew clipped, his smile more rigid. We argued, he admitted, his voice cooling to ice when I pressed about their last encounter. She wanted more than I could give. We were done. Done. The word hung in the air long after I left his office, its weight dragging me deeper into the shadows of the case. I started digging into Tom's past, piecing together fragments of his life that didn't fit his public persona. The deeper I delved, the more cracks appeared in his polished veneer. I spoke to Laura's friends, her family, anyone who had known her. They painted a picture of a woman spiraling into fear in the months before her disappearance. Laura had confided in a close friend that her relationship with Tom had turned dark, her life increasingly consumed by paranoia and dread. One night, I found myself sitting across from a bartender who had worked at the bar where Laura was last seen. His memory of that night sent a chill through me. They fought, he said, his voice low as if the memory itself carried weight. It wasn't just a lover's spat. She left in tears. He stayed, though. Calm. Too calm. The pieces of the puzzle began to take shape, but they formed no comforting picture. Tom wasn't just a man hiding secrets, he was a man who wore lies like a second skin. As I uncovered more of his world, the line between victim and villain blurred. Was Laura trying to escape from him? Or from something even darker? Each new revelation pulled me deeper into a web of manipulation and control. The narrative I was unraveling wasn't just about Laura's disappearance, it was about the people caught in Tom's orbit. People like me. It wasn't until I found a photograph, buried in Laura's old belongings, tucked away like a forgotten wound, that the realization struck. It was a candid shot of a group at a charity gala. There was Laura, radiant but distant, and beside her, Tom, his arm draped possessively over her shoulder. But there, in the corner, just out of focus, was someone else. Me. I didn't remember being there, didn't remember the photo being taken, but there I was, my younger self smiling obliviously in the background of their story. A cold dread seeped into my bones. Had Tom's shadow stretched over my life for longer than I'd realized? The deeper I dug, the clearer it became, Laura's story was no longer hers alone. It was mine. Tom's control, his calculated charm, it had ensnared us both. And as the walls closed in, I began to wonder if I was chasing the truth or running straight into the same darkness that had claimed her. Because the closer I got to finding Laura, the more I felt the weight of eyes on me, watching, waiting. As if the ending of this story had already been written, and I was merely playing my part. Story 10. For weeks, something felt off outside my bedroom window. Each night, just as sleep began to claim me, I'd catch a glimpse, a shadowed figure, perfectly still, lingering just beyond the glass. Its presence was unnerving, but every time I mustered the courage to pull back the curtain, there was nothing. Just the swaying trees and the quiet expanse of the yard. At first, I told myself it was my imagination. Shadows have a way of twisting into shapes when your mind is half asleep, and the trees outside could easily explain the eerie outlines. But as the nights wore on, the figure returned, always in the same spot, unmoving, as if it were watching or waiting. The pattern was too persistent to dismiss, and soon, the rational excuses began to crumble under the weight of my growing unease. One evening, determined to face whatever was haunting me, I stayed awake. Midnight approached, and I kept my eyes locked on the window, my pulse quickening with each passing second. Then, there it was. The figure materialized like a shadow drawn from the darkness, tall and silent. I grabbed the flashlight by my bedside and crept toward the window, my breath shallow and my hands trembling. When I flung back the curtain, my heart dropped. There was nothing there. The grass below was undisturbed, the stillness of the night unbroken. No footprints. No sign of movement. Relief and confusion battled within me, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The nights that followed were no better. The figure would reappear, sometimes closer than before but always just beyond the reach of the light. Each time I looked, it vanished as if it had never existed. I stopped mentioning it to anyone, afraid they'd dismiss me as paranoid, or worse, crazy. Yet, the sense of being watched gnawed at me, wearing down my nerves with every sleepless night. Then, one night, everything changed. I lay in bed, wide awake, when I noticed the figure again. This time, it didn't vanish when I pulled back the curtain. It was closer now, and for the first time, it was facing the window. My breath caught in my throat as I locked eyes with it, dark, empty hollows where its eyes should have been. Its face was obscured in shadow, but its presence was undeniable. The figure was taller than before, its body unnaturally rigid, like a mannequin brought to life. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as if the figure's very existence was suffocating me. Finally, I forced myself to step back. The moment I did, the figure turned slowly, almost deliberately, and faded into the night. The silence it left behind was deafening. The next morning, I scoured the area outside my window. I expected footprints, broken twigs, anything to prove that what I'd seen was real. But there was nothing. No trace of movement, no sign of an intruder. It was as if the figure had been a ghost, leaving no evidence of its presence. And yet, it wasn't over. In the nights that followed, the figure returned, but now it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it crept closer to the window each night. The air in my room grew heavier, charged with an invisible energy that felt almost alive. I dreaded the darkness, the sound of the wind through the trees, the moment I'd see it again. My once peaceful bedroom had become a prison of dread. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I left the room. I paced the house, hoping to shake the suffocating fear. But as I passed the hallway, I stopped cold. The window in my bedroom, shut tightly when I'd left, was open. The chill of the night air seeped in, carrying with it a silence so profound it felt unnatural. My heart thundered as I stepped into the room, my mind racing with questions. How had it opened? Why hadn't I heard it? I shut the window, my hands trembling, and stared out into the darkness. The yard was still and silent. No figure. No movement. Just an empty, quiet night. I told myself it was over, that whatever had haunted me was gone. But the weight of those nights lingered, pressing on the edges of my mind like a shadow that refused to fade. After that night, the figure never returned. I don't know what it was or why it had appeared, but it left me with a lingering sense of unease. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I catch myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see it again. And though it hasn't come back, the memory remains, a silent reminder of the thing that watched me from the darkness.